Hello, I'm Ryan Cook, and this is Civic Tech Chat, a podcast about the civic technology movement. We seek to harness the power technology has to improve the delivery of public services to people everywhere.
Mark, thank you so much for joining us here on Civic Tech Chat. Could you introduce yourself and tell us a bit about what you do?
Sure. I'm Mark Funkhauser. I'm president of a little consulting firm called Funkhauser & Associates. I've had a long career, so I've got a lot of formers. I was a former auditor, I was a former mayor, I was a former publisher of Governing Magazine, and now with Funkhauser & Associates, what we do is help local governments perform better, and we do that in lots of ways, but the main focus is on relationships.
What would you say is your personal why? That thing that drives you to get out of bed each morning and do what you do?
Well, if you care about people and you care about your family and your neighbors and so forth and so on, then local government becomes incredibly important. The quality of life, what are the parks like? What are the police like? What are the streets like? Is it safe? Is it clean? Is it nice? All that stuff is wound up in local government, in management and leadership and politics in local government. And I've been interested in that basically my entire adult life.
As you mentioned in your intro, you've worked in a number of different roles. You've worked as an auditor, you've been a teacher, you've been a publisher, you've served as the mayor of Kansas City, and as mentioned, you own your own firm now. As you're thinking back on that path, are there any lessons you've learned along the way that you'd be willing to share with folks?
Two come right to mind. One is this stuff is a lot harder than it looks. So local government, managing a local government, either in a role like as a city manager or in a role as a mayor, is really hard. And it's not gotten any easier over the decades. And so I've learned to have an awful lot of empathy and patience for folks. My stint as mayor was the most difficult thing I ever did. And I've had a very successful career. Things have gone well for me, but that was hard. And I see it now in other folks. The second thing that I've learned is that the people who work in government, state government, local government, are much better than they seem, than they seem in the media, than they seem from a distance. When you talk to them one-on-one, as we did at Governing and as I do now, and as you examine what they're doing, as I did as an auditor, what you find is they're trying hard. They're smart, they're honest, they're capable, and they're working as hard as they can, but it is difficult. And so I have grown over the years in my respect for folks who take the plunge and work in local government.
Are there any podcasts, print media, videos, or things on other mediums that you'd recommend to our listeners?
I am big for reading books. And so and the most important book that I've read over the last 10 years just came out recently, 2021, Heather McGhee's The Sum of Us, where she talks about race relations in the United States and the history of them and where it has brought us and what she calls the solidarity dividend when we are able to work together. Other books that have really influenced me, Colin Woodard did a book, American Nations, about the differences among us over our country. And then he did a recent book called Union, which is about the struggle to define the story of America over the last 250 years. And that struggle about the story of America still unfolds, with the 1619 Project versus the 1776 Project. That's a current issue. And I'm reading something right now by Zeynep Tufekci, Twitter and Tear Gas, which is really interesting, looking at the intersection of social media, protest, and governance in the world today. And I read probably a dozen different newsletters every morning. And the one that I pay the most attention to is Matt Iglesias's Slow Boring, because he cites so many studies and charts and graphs and data that, it's not just somebody spouting off opinions. There's an awful lot of sort of research behind it. I find it useful.
Let's go ahead and segue into our main topic around COVID-19 and its impact on state and local governments. So from your perspective, as you've been kind of looking at what's going on in those spaces, what level of impact would you say that we've seen so far on those sorts of governments?
It's been incredible. It's been off the charts. The 2020 was just, an awesome, and not in a good way, year for local government, because not only did you have the pandemic, and all that brought with it, but you had a huge economic disruption and turmoil. And then with the murder of George Floyd, you had the largest social protest movement in the history of the United States. And trying to fairly and effectively deliver services in the middle of all that, manage your staff in the middle of all that, has just been incredibly challenging. And the changes just keep coming, one after another. We had the most contested and tempestuous election in 2020 that we have had in generations. And elections are administered by secretaries of state at the state level and county and city boards of elections. Those are local government having to manage that stuff. So it's just, when I listen and talk to folks, it is just overwhelming. And at this point now, in late May, and of course we had the whole vaccination, mask, no mask, all that, controversy. Many of the local government folks are just tired. They're just worn out by the stress. And we've all had a lot of stress, but some of us have not had to manage everybody else's stress too.
No doubt. Yeah, it's definitely been a difficult year for everybody. And I imagine that this is something that's costs those local governments a considerable amount of revenue coming in to provide services. And I would suspect that there are some folks listening that maybe are familiar with the idea of like a rainy day fund, whether they've heard it when someone's been running for office, in a campaign, something like that. It usually gets talked about. Is that mechanism something that, I guess what I would suspect is that probably a crisis like this is just far too big for any state to like reasonably plan for it in that sort of capacity. Is that something that from your perspective is true? Or are there things states could be trying to do to try to prepare for events of this level?
2 or 3 responses to that, Ryan. One, the Great Recession of 2007, 8, 9 was devastating for state, but particularly local governments. And there's a real divergence between the revenue structures of states and local governments. States have a more stable revenue structure, and they set the rules for local government. And those rules are not friendly usually to local government. So local governments really got hit hard in the Great Recession, and they learned a lot of lessons about the rainy day fund, build it up, take care of it. And when this pandemic hit, they had built their reserves up to the historic levels. They had done a good job of putting aside money. But this thing was sudden and huge. And of course, it devastated those reserve funds. And what happened in many cases was that people, when revenue dropped like a rock, And yet you have essential workers like firefighters, EMT, police, and so forth. The garbage still needs to be picked up. All that stuff needs to happen. A lot of places spent down their reserve funds rather than lay people off. And fortunately, the CARES Act reimbursed at least the costs. There were extraordinary costs associated, including the pay of those essential workers, but it did not allow governments to replace lost revenue. And the revenue impact was, in many cases, much greater than the cost impact of the pandemic.
That must have been quite a well, to use the idiom, a great leap of faith on their part to do things like pay off from the reserve in order to keep the quality of life of folks working for the government there. I imagine because I guess we'll talk about the response here in a little bit, but I guess they're under the assumption that the federal government will do something, right, in order to kind of help us out. I imagine that's a difficult decision to make in that situation.
Well, if I drop you in the middle of the ocean and you start treading water, you're going to tread water as long as you can. You're going to hope somebody shows up to save you, but you're going to keep treading water. And that's really, there was a lot of talk that was encouraging at the federal level that, gave people some hope. But mostly, of course, the really prudent managers in local government began immediately to furlough folks and hold on to their cash and so on. And basically what you're trying to do, that's why you have a reserve fund, is to try and get you through this period. But you have to be, you don't just keep whistling in the dark and spending money and hope that things get better. You do two things at the same time. First, you start making changes. And then second, you also use your reserve fund to carry you to where you hope those changes will have effect and impact.
In response to what we've talked about, as state and local governments have been out there, trying to tread water and survive this year, the federal government is going to do something, as it turns out. The Biden administration has included funds for state and local governments in the American Rescue Plan. For folks that maybe haven't heard much about that package, can you give us a high-level description of what it is?
Well, it is a huge package. It's like 1.9 trillion or something like that. But and there are lots of different funds in it, including checks to many Americans of $1,400. But for state and local government, it's $350 billion in direct aid. For perspective, that is much larger than the CARES Act. And the scope of what you're allowed to use the money for is much broader than under the CARES Act, including specifically replacing lost revenue within certain parameters. So it is huge, and it represents an opportunity for local governments to make transformative kinds of changes. And so prudent local government leaders are looking at it very carefully as, this is a once in a generation kind of opportunity. Let's don't blow it.
As you mentioned, we are talking about a program with a lot of money. I think you alluded to that $350 billion, where it's 195-ish of it is going to states, another 65 to counties, another 45, I guess closer to 46 to cities. Among then other allocations, there's some other funds there too for other types of communities. Does the sheer scale of that affect how those getting these funds ultimately go about making spending decisions and how they're going to use them?
I think it does. And what it does is tell you that, as I said, this is a transformative opportunity. It's much bigger than, just sort of a normal amount of money. And so you want to you want to sort of rise to the occasion. There's saying, to whom much is given, much is expected. Your citizens expect you to do big things with big money, and they want to see what you've done. So I think the first effect was sort of daunting. Local government folks sort of stopped and said, "Oh, wow, this is a big deal. Let's give this some careful thought. How are we going to do this?" It's a much, just like they faced a pandemic unlike anything they've ever seen. Now they're looking at a rescue package unlike anything they've ever seen.
Something I think I'm maybe hearing there is, we've all heard the narrative that public trust has been declining, especially like over the course of the pandemic. I think something I hear kind of in the tone of what you're saying is that maybe that's something that's in the back of these community leaders' minds, is like, if I don't use this money wisely, that will erode that in my community. Is that something you think folks are giving a lot of mind to?
I think it is. You have to put that in a context. The trust in government in the United States and really around the world has been declining for decades. It has been slowly eroding for a long time. And trust in local government has always been more, higher. Local governments, something like 60-70% of folks say that they have some or a lot of trust in local government, compared to, say, 20% for state government and about 10% for the federal government. And initially in the pandemic, in the first 3 months of the pandemic, so through May of 20, trust in local government actually went up. People saw local governments responding in ways that they approved of. And there was maybe a 10 or 20 point increase. Now, with all the controversy over the masks, over the vaccine, over everything else, over the election, yes, trust is going back down. And it's doubly difficult because not only is there trust deficit between citizens and their government, but there's a huge trust deficit between citizens and their fellow citizens. So it's, in order to engage the community, there has to be a community. And it's when they're so fractured and so much antipathy, and not just partisanship in the old way, but outright hostility, between members of your community. It makes it really, really hard. And so when you put that in the context of where they are now with the American Rescue Plan, local leaders are, yes, they're looking for an opportunity to build credibility and build legitimacy, and show people that your local government can make changes that are good for you in the community. And so they're really focused on engaging community folks carefully around this money.
Another influence on how they choose to use it, I imagine, is going to be the intent that the federal government has. And I believe I saw, if you go to the Treasury website, you can kind of see what some of the kind of higher level funding objectives for the program are. Those include things like supporting COVID-19 response efforts, replacing lost revenues that support public services and job retention. I think that was something you alluded to just before. Support for economic stabilization, and addressing public health and economic challenges that have contributed to an unequal pandemic impact. What do these goals tell you and others that are observers in the space about how the federal government is hoping this money gets spent?
I had a certain view when the act was passed about how it would be spent. And I thought that, for example, those local governments that did spend down reserves would be able to replenish those reserves and do other kinds of things to restore sort of a structural balance to their budget. But when the rules came out, the interim final rules in May 10th, it became clear that there was a different focus than I would have imagined. And it's got, I think, three components. One is they specifically aren't allowing you to put it back into the reserves. They want the money spent. They want it spent. They want it to have an impact. So they want to see you do things with the money. The second thing is there is a real serious, deep focus on social equity. And so they want you to look at your community through the lens of equity, and they would like to see you spending this money in ways that address inequities. And then the third thing that came through to me, and I sort of seized on this as a former performance auditor, is that there is an emphasis on performance reporting. So it's not just that they want you to report on the money and sort of show how you spent it so that it's spent legally and so on, but they want to see an impact. They want you to report how you changed lives in the community. And so and those are all good things. They want it spent, and they want it spent now. They want you to look at issues of social equity, and that's incredibly important. And they want you to report on your performance.
Something you mentioned there also stuck out to me, which was that goal around addressing the unequal impact that COVID's had, which I believe also means kind of trying to address systemic problems that lead to that. For example, you could look at a project in Chicago called Mapping COVID Recovery. It's this really neat thing where you can look at some mapping data that they use, where it shows some inequitable policies and their impacts that likely then also impact COVID. Whether you're looking at like shares of pre-existing health conditions that happen in different parts of the city, that then, for folks that aren't familiar with Chicago, geography very much strongly correlates to things like race and socioeconomics. So those things have like real impacts then on how COVID hits. So when you see that there's larger infection rates in certain areas of the city, that kind of acts as a bit of a proxy as you're thinking about it. For other local governments and state governments that are looking to maybe try to address some of those things with these funds, how would you expect them to try and do that as they're getting that infusion?
So yes, COVID with the disproportionate death rates for people of color, hugely disproportionate, highlighted underlying trends, inequities throughout our government. And then with the murder of George Floyd, there was this huge focus on police and the way that police interact with communities of color. But where we went from there is that when we began to look at the impact of COVID and the police violence against communities of color, we began to see more clearly that throughout our governments, in almost every area of operation of government, we could find social inequities in the way we issue permits. In the you see things like, where are the heat islands? Where is the asthma? Where all this kind of stuff. And we've known that there have been what we call the social determinants of health, that there have been disparate impacts on diabetes, asthma, and so forth and so on across all those areas. But we are now focused on this. And we now see this as something that you really have to deal with if you're going to make community better, really, for everybody. So there are two ways that governments need to look at this, I think. One is that they need to disaggregate data and look at, just what you described in Chicago. Take the data and look at it and disaggregate it across, geography, zip code, census tract, as well as, racial and ethnic groups and income groups. And the second thing is you need to talk to people. you need to, if I want, as an older white man, if I want to know how my government impacts a young black woman, I need to ask her. And government needs to be in a position where it's carefully asking all the members of its community. And of course, when you do that, you find wildly different perceptions and life experiences and so forth and so on. So look at the data and ask the people. And I guess I would add one third thing. Government is rapidly becoming, the workforce is rapidly becoming more diverse. And the diversity is coming, of course, in younger cohorts. So we're, people, the sort of class of folks who work in government who are 25 to 35 years old are more diverse than the 35 to 45 and more diverse still than the 45 to 55 and so on. Listen to those young people and let them bring their whole self to work. Don't ask them to look at the government and carry out their role as if they were a 55-year-old white man. Ask them about their own experiences and let them bring their own self into the work, and you will do a better job of being a good government.
That last point you make is really interesting, because that also starts to get into the idea of what is your workforce culture in your local government, and you yourself you've been the chief executive of a municipality, and you probably were thinking about what sort of culture am I propagating through my choices, through my actions, that sort of thing, and what do I want it to be? As someone who's been in that role, what advice would you give to others in local government that maybe they want to create the culture you're talking about, where it's like, hey, like I want a diverse set of folks to be able to bring their whole self, so we get the benefit of their experiences, their perspectives, the life they've lived, right? And that way, effectively, it makes your government more representative. What advice would you give those folks?
Human resources, rules and regs level, how are we recruiting? How are we screening? How do we decide who's a quote unquote good fit or not? The journalist Barrett and Green, who I worked with a lot at governing, just had a piece up on Route 50 a couple of days ago about the barriers that people of color have faced in being hired by state and local government. So what are the barriers, and how do they impact? And when people say, oh, well, the pool of applicants just isn't right. Well, change the pool of applicants. How are you deciding how that is? It requires real effort. This is something that you have to look at. Why are we not attracting the people that we want to attract? Hire them, promote them, recommend them, nominate them, all that sort of thing. I wrote a piece about a year ago about the virtual absence of Black women city managers, and the way to deal with that is to hold up the ones that are there, encourage them to hire other folks, and put them in positions of authority and power where they can impact the workforce, and they can hire more entry-level employees who are Black women and allow them to be trained and promoted and moved up through the ranks and so on.
Another thing that you had mentioned when we were talking about the COVID relief package is this idea that there's performance reporting, and that there's measures that I imagine they're going to be looking to take, essentially to try to say, hey, this money I spent, did it have the impact that I'm hoping for? And I imagine there's a lot of difficulties with that, whether it's in, well, even picking what am I measuring, but then even beyond that, like how do I make sure I have the right data and then the right tools to use that data and then have those measures to then ostensibly make choices based on. So how do you think folks should, I guess, first of all, approach deciding on what measures are most helpful as they're kind of looking at that impact space?
When you're looking, at measures, To me, you don't want to look at like a dozen, or 2 dozen. You want to hone in on a few. I used to tell people there's a couple of measures in Kansas City that really we needed to focus on and that mattered a lot. One was the infant mortality rate. How does the infant mortality rate change in the city by geographic area and by racial and ethnic group? Because it is a sort of a canary in the mine shaft that tells you all kinds of other things. So focusing on that, paying attention to that, why is it what it is? And the other was, I'm a huge believer in surveying people and asking people and polling them and looking at social media and what they say and so on and so forth. And in Kansas City, I did citizen surveys year in and year out as a city auditor and then as the mayor. And one of the most critical questions was, how do you rate Kansas City as a place to raise children? Because if people don't think it's a good place to raise children, that's an indicator of lots of other problems. And it tells you a good place to, I actually wrote something when I was at governing called the stroller index, which basically said, how many people do you see pushing babies in strollers around your town? Because that tells you if it's a good place to raise a child, it's a good place to be an older person. Bad sidewalks are bad for strollers, but they're also bad for your average 80-year-old. They're bad for people in wheelchairs and with walkers and so on and so forth. So looking at a few critical measures and then going back to what I said earlier, disaggregate the data and ask people, do a lot of different kinds of asking people and listening to people.
As one might seek to support those measures that you're talking about, there's a lot of infrastructure that can happen, whether we're talking about having the technology to store information, whether we're talking about having the infrastructure to collect it. Maybe it's to have the folks around to be able to do the research to start to talk to people, maybe almost akin to the kind of user research maybe the tech folks that are listening to this might be accustomed to. But that can apply to government as well. As you mentioned, sometimes you need to talk to people to figure out how things are impacting them. In your experience, what are some ways that folks can try to make good choices in order to ensure that infrastructure is well supported, that the investments are there, so that when it comes time to try to, maybe I want to collect some data to do one of these measures, that things are ready for that?
Well, you said investment. It is an investment. To me, it makes perfect sense to spend $5 out of every 100 to see how the other $95 work. And there are two sort of fronts to look at to make sure that infrastructure is there. Lots of governments have some sort of office of performance improvement or data analysis or something like that near the top of the government, reporting to the mayor or the city manager, something like that. That is a very good thing. You need to have that. That needs to be there, and it needs to have access across all of government. So public works, police, parks, et cetera, et cetera. That sort of, New York City at one time was a real leader in that, and that's critically important. But the second thing is that you need to have an independent city audit function doing performance auditing. I mean, I believed in that. I wrote a book called Honest, Competent Government, The Promise of Performance Auditing. You need a third party to look at what you're doing and give you advice and suggestions, confirmation when you're doing it right, criticism when you're doing it wrong. But and when you ask citizens in charter reviews and so forth and so on, referendums, do they want that? They do. So every government needs to be sure that, independent of the city manager and the mayor, there's an audit function that can look at performance, not just the financial data. We don't want to just not steal the money. We'd actually like to spend it wisely.
In adjusting to the constraints of COVID, these governments we've been talking about have also had to learn how to use technical infrastructure in new ways in regards to communication, keeping in touch with their constituents. Are there practices that you've seen out there that you think are working especially well?
Yeah, I mean, there's been actually a lot that has worked well. I mean, they pivoted to virtual meetings almost overnight. They began to do paperless kind of permitting and so forth, again, almost overnight. They set up first COVID testing and so forth sites, then they set up vaccination sites using technology. The Pierce County, Washington, set up a dashboard of like 94 different indicators about how they were spending money, what they were doing, who was getting tested, where the COVID was, and so on and so forth. So that's been there are sort of good news stories across local governments about that, but it has come at a significant cost in terms of stress and effort. I heard today about one government where they went to the IT manager to ask them to set up another process, and the person burst into tears. They're just too tired. They're just too much, and so we've done really, really well. Many city managers and so forth that I talked to express really surprise and admiration for how agile their government turned out to be. They did things they did not realize they could do, but it's been hard, and we really have to focus now on supporting people, including, the ways in which we ask them to come back to the office. Those are all going to be real difficult challenges.
Do you suspect that there will be any sort of rubber band effect with some of these things as the in-person restrictions relax, where there might be this natural inclination to kind of just flip the switch back to how things were before the crisis? If so, do you think government should try to push back and try to maintain some of the practices that they've learned?
There may be some sort of rubber band effect. No doubt there probably will be, but governments will push back. Their employees will push back. We're never going back to where we were in the before time. This is new, this is different, and we're going to spend another year or two figuring out what the new normal is, but it's not going to look anything like what it was at the end of 2019.
The tradition on Civic Tech Chat is to have a space toward the tail end of our conversation so that the guests can give us an idea of what we should leave this conversation thinking about. So, Mark, for you and this chat we've had today, what would you say those concluding thoughts are?
I think that what I would like to leave people with is how important it is for every single person in a community to have some engagement and involvement with their local government. If you're not an employee, volunteer for a board, serve on some commission, but we all have a responsibility, and you need to be engaged. You need to be involved. You can't stand off at a distance and say, well, yeah, that doesn't impact me. You breathe the air, you drink the water, you walk the streets. It matters to you. It matters to the people that you love. Get involved.
Mark, thank you so much for joining us on Civic Tech Chat for this conversation. I have no doubt that folks will have some tidbits of wisdom in what you've said to take into their day.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here with you, Ron.
You can follow us on Twitter using the handle @CivicTechChat. Visit us on the web at civictech.chat, or subscribe to us for content updates wherever it is you download your podcasts.